It was a cold afternoon in the heart of Yorkshire when Margaret stepped out of the corner shop, a small paper bag of groceries in her arms. The rain had been falling all morning, leaving the cobbled street slick and treacherous. She tightened her scarf around her neck, lowering her head against the wind, determined to return quickly to the house where she now lived with her daughter Clara, her son-in-law Edward, and her little grandson Henry. Her shoe slipped suddenly on the wet stones. The bag tore from her grasp, apples rolling into the gutter as her body collapsed hard against the ground. Pain seared through her hip, sharp and merciless. For a long moment she could not move. She tried to reach into her coat pocket for her phone, only to discover there was no service. The line had been cut off weeks earlier, though she had not been told why. The street was nearly empty. A lorry roared past, sending a spray of water over her legs, and then silence returned. Margaret lay shivering, the chill of the stones seeping into her bones. She prayed someone might notice. At last, she heard the familiar sound of a car horn. Edward's voice carried through the drizzle. "There you are. For heaven's sake, Margaret, what have you done now?" He climbed out, not to comfort her, but to scold. "Always causing trouble. Do you not realize the time I've wasted looking for you?" Margaret tried to explain, her voice trembling. But Edward cut her short. "Honestly, Clara and I have enough to deal with, without you lying about in the road. Get up, we're late for Henry's supper." He hauled her to her feet with a rough hand, the sting of humiliation piercing deeper than the ache in her hip. As they drove back in silence, Margaret caught her daughter's face in the window reflection when they reached the house. Clara said nothing. Not a word of concern, not even a glance. That night, while Margaret lay in her small attic room nursing her bruises, she could hear Edward laughing downstairs, the clatter of cutlery, the warm chatter of a family dinner to which she was not invited. She had cooked for them countless evenings, yet tonight they had gone out without her, celebrating somewhere grand while she sat alone. Her heart twisted with a painful truth she had long tried to ignore. In this house, she was not family. She was merely convenient. And it was then she heard a small knock at her door. The voice of little Henry, barely above a whisper. "Grandma. I don't want you living here. Please go back to your own place." Margaret froze, the words echoing in the stillness of the night, more wounding than the fall on the cobbled street. The next morning, Margaret descended the narrow staircase, one hand clutching the rail to ease the ache still throbbing in her hip. The smell of toast and fried eggs filled the kitchen. Edward sat at the head of the table with a newspaper spread before him. Clara was buttering bread, her eyes fixed on the plate as if she dared not look up. Henry munched his cereal, legs swinging beneath the chair, innocence in his eyes yet cruel truth still lingering in Margaret's ears. The memory of his words from last night cut deep, but she forced a faint smile. "Good morning, everyone." No one answered. Edward flipped a page of the paper with a sigh. Clara pushed a slice of toast towards Henry but gave none to her mother. The scrape of cutlery was the only reply. Margaret sat quietly at the corner, waiting. When the teapot stood before her, she reached for it, but Edward's hand snatched it away. "We've only just enough for Clara and Henry," he muttered, without even glancing at her. The silence grew heavy, like a fog. Margaret's eyes wandered to the sideboard, where her pension letter sat unopened. Weeks ago, she had handed her bank card to Clara, trusting her to manage the bills. Since then, she had not seen a statement, nor touched her own savings. "Clara," she ventured softly, "I was wondering if I might check my account. Just to see how things are going." Clara's butter knife froze in midair. Edward lowered the paper at last, his voice sharp. "Your money is safe, Margaret. Why must you nag? We've spent it all on this house, on food, on Henry's schooling. What more do you expect?" Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. She had given everything, her home in Bath sold, her savings transferred, her independence handed over for the promise of family. And yet, in this house, she was treated as a nuisance. As Henry climbed down from his chair, he turned to his grandmother. "Grandma, Daddy says you don't pay for anything. Is that true?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. She had been feeding them, scrubbing their clothes, minding Henry when no one else would. And now, the child she loved believed she gave nothing. Before she could answer, Edward rose, his chair scraping the floor. "Enough chatter. Margaret, you can wash the dishes. Clara and I have errands in town." He placed his hand on Clara's shoulder, guiding her to the door. The kitchen fell silent as the door slammed shut. Margaret stood alone among the dirty plates, her body weary but her spirit simmering. She looked at the locked drawer where Clara kept her letters. Something inside whispered that the truth about her missing money was hidden there. Her hand trembled as she reached for the drawer, heart pounding with guilt and desperation. At that very moment, Henry's small voice drifted from the hallway. "Grandma, what are you doing?" Margaret froze, her hand still resting on the drawer handle. Henry stood in the doorway, clutching his toy soldier, eyes wide with curiosity. His innocent question hung in the air like a warning. She forced a smile. "Nothing, darling. Just tidying up." But her voice trembled, and Henry tilted his head as if sensing her unease. When he finally skipped away, humming to himself, Margaret exhaled shakily. The drawer remained locked, the key nowhere in sight. She knew Clara kept it hidden in her dressing table upstairs, but the thought of searching felt dangerous. One wrong move, and Edward's anger would be merciless. The day passed slowly. Margaret scrubbed dishes, swept the hallway, folded laundry, her hip throbbing with every step. Each task reminded her of her old home in Bath, the little garden she had left behind, the roses that once bloomed by her window. She had given it all up to live under this roof. And now, even her grandson wished her gone. By evening, Clara and Edward returned, their laughter filling the hall. They carried bags from the butcher and bottles of fine wine. The scent of roast beef soon drifted through the kitchen, rich and tempting. Margaret's stomach knotted with hunger, but no plate was set for her. She retreated quietly to her attic room. From there, she could hear the clinking of glasses, Edward's booming voice, Clara's soft giggles, Henry's cheerful chatter. A feast was unfolding downstairs, while she sat with nothing but stale bread and cold tea. Margaret's heart ached. She had used her pension to help buy those very meals, yet she was left to starve. For the first time in years, anger burned hotter than sorrow. She would not endure this silence any longer. That night, while the household slept, she crept down the creaking stairs. Moonlight spilled through the hallway, casting long shadows across the floor. Her hand found the drawer again. She pressed her ear close, listening for the faintest stir upstairs. Nothing but the soft rhythm of sleep. With trembling fingers, she took the thin hairpin from her bun. Slowly, carefully, she slid it into the lock. Her breath caught as the metal scraped. A click echoed in the stillness. The drawer eased open. Inside lay a stack of letters, bank statements with her name across them. Margaret's pulse quickened. She lifted the first page, eyes darting across the figures. Thousands, gone. Every penny she had saved over a lifetime, drained without her knowledge. She clutched the paper, her chest heaving. Betrayal screamed from the ink, tearing through her heart. Then came a sound that froze her blood. The low creak of a floorboard above. Someone was awake. Margaret's heart pounded as she slid the papers back into the drawer. Her hands trembled so fiercely she could barely guide the lock shut. The floorboard above groaned again, followed by the faint creak of a door. She froze, listening. Every breath seemed deafening in the silence. Then, light spilled faintly down the staircase, Clara's shadow drifting across the landing. "Mother." Clara's voice was hushed, uncertain. "Is that you?" Margaret backed away from the drawer, her pulse racing. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders and forced a calm tone. I was just getting some water. Clara descended a few steps, her face pale in the moonlight. Her eyes flicked to the hall table, to the drawer that now looked undisturbed. Margaret held her breath. At last Clara sighed. You should be asleep, Mother. You'll make yourself ill wandering at night. She reached for Margaret's arm, guiding her gently but firmly toward the stairs. Come along. Margaret allowed herself to be led away, though every fiber of her being screamed to run. The knowledge she had glimpsed, the vanished savings, the stolen independence, burned inside her chest. She wanted to cry out, to demand answers, yet the fear of Edward's wrath chained her tongue. Back in her attic room, she lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling beams. She could not unsee those bank statements. She could not unhear Clara's silence. The next day brought no comfort. Edward swaggered about the house, speaking of plans for a new car, a holiday abroad. Each boast twisted Margaret's stomach tighter, for she now knew whose money he had spent. As she folded laundry by the window, Henry toddled in, dragging his school satchel. He dropped it with a thud, scattering papers. Among them lay a crumpled receipt, 2 tickets for a fine restaurant in the city, dated the very night Margaret had been left alone after her fall. She picked it up with trembling fingers. So it was true. While she sat bruised and hungry, they had dined on her savings. Henry looked up at her with wide eyes. Grandma, Daddy says you'll be happier when you go back to your old house. Do you still have it? Margaret's throat tightened. No, sweetheart. I gave it up, for all of you. At that moment, Edward's voice thundered from the hall. Henry! Where are you? The boy darted away, leaving Margaret clutching the receipt in her hand. Her heart hammered as Edward's footsteps approached. And then the door swung open. Edward filled the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light from the hall. His eyes narrowed as they landed on the paper in Margaret's trembling hand. What's that? His tone was sharp, dangerous. Margaret hid the receipt behind her apron, forcing her voice steady. Just something Henry dropped from his school bag. Edward strode forward, snatching it from her grasp. His lips curled as he read the words. You've been snooping. Her breath caught. I only picked it up. He loomed closer, his voice low. Listen carefully, Margaret. This house runs because Clara and I manage it. You've no say in money, no say in decisions. Understand? Margaret felt her knees weaken, yet anger flared within her chest. But it was my money. My home, my savings. All gone, while I live here as though I am nothing. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Edward's jaw tightened, his eyes cold as steel. For a moment she feared he might strike her. Then Clara appeared at the doorway, her face pale. Edward, please. But Edward cut her off with a raised hand. She needs reminding of her place. Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to look away. And what place is that? A servant? A burden? A shadow in her own family's house? Clara flinched as though struck, but said nothing. Edward's fists clenched at his sides. Henry's small footsteps pattered down the corridor. He peeked around his father's leg, his eyes wide with confusion. Daddy, why are you shouting at Grandma? The room froze. Edward straightened, his expression softening only for the boy. Go back upstairs, Henry. This isn't your concern. But Henry did not move. He looked between them all, his young voice trembling. Grandma, are you going to leave us? Margaret's heart wavered. She had no answer. She could not bear the thought of abandoning him, yet she could no longer endure this prison. Edward's voice sliced through her thoughts. Enough. Tomorrow, we'll look into a care home for you. Somewhere more suitable. The word struck like a blade, A care home. Cast out, discarded, exiled from the very family she had given everything to protect. Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her breath shallow, her hands cold. But in her eyes, a spark began to burn, a spark of defiance that had been smothered too long. And Edward saw it. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow attic bed, staring at the moonlit rafters, Edward's words echoing in her mind. A care home. Somewhere more suitable. Suitable for whom? For Edward, so he could spend her savings without question. For Clara, so she could keep her silence without guilt. By dawn, her decision was made. When the house stirred awake, Margaret was already dressed, her small case packed with the few belongings she still owned, a worn shawl, a Bible, a faded photograph of Clara as a child. Her heart trembled, but her resolve was firm. Downstairs, Edward was tying his tie, Clara buttering toast. Neither noticed Margaret at first. Henry, however, did. He ran to her, eyes wide with alarm. "Grandma! Why do you have your bag?" Edward looked up, his expression hardening. "What's this?" Margaret stood tall, her voice clear though her hands shook. "I will not be sent away like rubbish. I will leave, yes, but on my own terms. I am going back to Bath. To my own place." Clara gasped, dropping the knife with a clatter. Edward's mouth twisted into a sneer. "And how will you live, Margaret? You've nothing left." Margaret held his gaze, pulling a folded receipt from her pocket, the very one he had tried to snatch away. "I have truth. And truth, Edward, has a way of finding ears willing to listen." For the first time, his eyes flickered with unease. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, silent tears forming. Henry clung to his grandmother's skirt. "Grandma, please don't go." Her heart cracked, yet she bent to kiss his hair. "I must, Henry. But I'll always love you. Always." She rose, straightening her shoulders. With one last glance at the table where she had been treated as invisible, she stepped toward the door. The morning air was cold, biting against her cheeks, but it carried with it a sweetness she had not felt in years. Freedom. Behind her, Edward's voice thundered through the doorway. "If you walk out, Margaret, don't expect to come back." She did not turn. Her feet carried her down the cobbled path, each step echoing louder than his threats. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt alive. Yet she also knew one truth with chilling certainty: Edward would not let her go without a fight. The train from Yorkshire rattled southward, carrying Margaret through misted fields and towns that blurred past the window. She sat upright, her small case at her feet, clutching her shawl tightly. Each mile between her and Edward felt like air returning to her lungs. Bath welcomed her with the familiar scent of damp stone and river breeze. The Georgian terraces still stood proud, though her little house was no longer hers. She walked past it slowly, heart aching at the roses still climbing the gate. A young couple lived there now, their laughter spilling from the windows. Margaret pressed on. She rented a modest room above a bakery, the warmth of fresh bread seeping through the floorboards at dawn. The baker's wife, kind-eyed Mrs. Palmer, welcomed her without question. "You'll be safe here, love. Start fresh." And Margaret did. She began selling embroidered handkerchiefs and repairing old garments for neighbors. Word spread quickly. Soon, townsfolk admired her neat stitches and gentle manner. For the first time in years, her days were her own. But Edward had not forgotten. Weeks later, as she returned from market with a basket of eggs and flour, she spotted him across the square. His broad shoulders, his sharp gaze, impossible to mistake. Clara trailed behind him, looking wan, and Henry clutched her hand. Margaret froze, her breath caught in her chest. Edward's eyes found hers instantly. A smile, cold, triumphant, curved across his lips. That evening, a letter arrived at the bakery. The handwriting was Edward's, bold and heavy. Margaret. You cannot escape your obligations. Clara and Henry are suffering in your absence. You will return at once, or I will ensure the town learns the truth of how you abandoned your family. Think carefully. Margaret's hands shook as she read. Yet instead of fear, a new strength coursed through her veins. She was no longer under his roof, no longer bound by his rules. The next morning, she walked to the town hall, the letter clutched in her hand. People she had stitched for, baked for, nodded kindly as she passed. She realized Edward's power ended at the threshold of his house. Out here, truth had allies. And Margaret was ready to speak it aloud. The town hall smelled faintly of polish and paper, its tall windows pouring light across the stone floor. Margaret stood at the threshold, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, the folded letter trembling in her hand. Inside, councillors and townsfolk bustled about, arranging chairs for the weekly assembly. Mrs. Palmer spotted her and waved warmly. Margaret, dear, come sit with us. But Margaret shook her head. Her heart pounded, yet her voice was steady. I must speak today. When the meeting began, the mayor called for public concerns. Murmurs quieted as Margaret rose from her seat. All eyes turned toward her, this small, grey-haired woman who had once been a shadow in her own family. She laid Edward's letter upon the desk, her fingers firm. My name is Margaret Whitfield. Some of you know me for my sewing, others for the bread I share on market days. But today, you must know me for the truth. Her words carried through the chamber. She told them of her fall, of Edward's neglect, of how she had given up her home and savings only to be treated as a burden. Gasps rippled when she described being left alone while they dined at fine restaurants. Finally, she held up the letter. And now, my son-in-law threatens me, claims I have abandoned my family, when in truth I was cast aside. He wishes to silence me. I will not be silent any longer. The hall erupted in whispers. Mrs. Palmer rose to her feet. We've all seen her kindness. We know she speaks true. Others chimed in, shopkeepers, neighbors, even strangers who had received her needlework. By the time Margaret sat down, her hands trembling with release, the mayor himself nodded gravely. Mrs. Whitfield, you have the town's support. No one here will believe his lies. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a weight lift. She was not alone. Her voice mattered. But outside the hall, in the shadow of the square, Edward watched. His eyes burned with fury as the townsfolk gathered around Margaret in comfort. He would not let her victory rest. The autumn air in Bath was sharp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Margaret walked through the square the next morning, a sense of calm anchoring her steps. The people of the town had spoken. She was no longer the silenced grandmother hidden in the attic. She was Margaret Whitfield, a woman with her own voice. But Edward was waiting. He stood in the center of the square, Clara and Henry beside him. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched. The crowd that had gathered at the market quickly hushed, sensing confrontation. Margaret, Edward called, his voice booming. This foolish rebellion ends today. You belong with your family. You will come home. Margaret stopped, her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders. Home. You call it home, Edward, but it was a prison. I will not return. Clara's eyes glistened with tears, but she said nothing. Henry tugged at her hand, whispering, Mummy, let Grandma stay. Edward's face darkened. He stepped closer, raising his voice for all to hear. She lies. She abandoned us, abandoned her own grandson. Margaret lifted her hand, silencing him. No, Edward. The truth has already been heard. These people know what you are. You cannot twist their ears with lies. The townsfolk stirred, murmuring in agreement. Mrs. Palmer stepped forward. We stand with Margaret. She deserves respect, not chains. Others joined, shopkeepers, bakers, neighbors, until their voices rose in one accord. She stays free. She stays free. Edward's face flushed crimson. For a moment, it seemed he might strike out, but the wall of townspeople moved between him and Margaret. Clara looked at her mother, torn, her lips trembling. At last, she whispered, "Forgive me, Mum." Then, in a voice Edward could not silence, she added, "You were right all along." Edward froze, betrayed by his own wife's words. His grip on Henry faltered. The boy broke free, running into Margaret's arms. She gathered him close, tears spilling down her cheeks. The square rang with the sound of townsfolk applauding, their voices drowning Edward's threats. He stood alone, his power broken, the crowd turning against him. Margaret held Henry tightly, feeling the warmth of his small arms. She looked up at Clara, who was crying softly, guilt etched across her face. Margaret did not yet know if she could forgive, but she knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer afraid. As the bells of Bath Abbey tolled above the square, Margaret raised her chin to the sky. Her life was hers again, her spirit unshackled. And for the first time in many years, she smiled, not for duty, not for pretense, but for freedom.